Hello and welcome to the Steps to Effective SharePoint Governance. My name is Richard Harbridge. I'm going to be presenting the talk today. If you'd like to follow along in Twitter, the hashtag is SPGOV or SPGov, and my handle is rharbridge, so please feel free to message me. I'll try and be like a ninja, skip in and out, and answer some of those questions. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. As I said, my name is Richard Harbridge. I actually work for a company in the United States called All In Consulting. And All In Consulting does a lot of SharePoint consulting. We do, branding projects, UX design. We do a lot of integration projects, upgrades, migrations, sort of the typical SharePoint projects. In addition to that, we actually do a fair amount of SharePoint strategy sessions and strategy consultation. And what that means is we'll go in and we'll help organizations determine, what's the right governance approach for them, how should they approach governance, what types of, policies do they need to enact, what types of legal considerations do they need to have, what's the right technical strategy for them, how does it play into other systems, and so on and so forth. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is something that I do on a regular basis. In addition to that, I've been lucky enough to be working with SharePoint for around 7 years now, and I've worked both as a consultant for a large amount of that, as well as internally with organizations. So I've been on both sides of the fence, and a lot of the governance stuff that I'm talking about today, I've seen work internally when I was leading those governance teams and working through it that way, and also as a consultant working with many clients over time and seeing what's working, what's not working. So again, today is really about what I've seen work, and hopefully very little about what I have seen not work. Just some context, I do have some technical background, so if you do have some technical questions, feel free to send them afterwards to me or during. I'll try and get to them. But again, today's really more about the business factors and how do we really approach governance from a non-technical perspective. So our goal today is to really create confidence, clarity, and direction. It's to create this sense of what is SharePoint governance, how do I deal with it, and how do I tactically execute SharePoint governance? Like, what are the documents I need, what are the processes I need, what are the teams and roles and responsibilities that I need in order to make this thing work. So that's what we're going to try and cover today. And hopefully by the end of it, you feel a bit more confident when you get asked, what is our SharePoint governance strategy, or how are we approaching SharePoint governance, and other types of questions like that. In addition to this, if you haven't noticed, I do talk pretty fast. I, in fact, normally overload people with information. So that's the goal today. So again, if you feel a little bit flustered, don't worry. As we go through the presentation, you'll be able to get a recording of it afterwards. You'll also be able to get a copy of it if you email me or connect with me. And through the website, you'll also be able to get some. So why do I need effective governance? That's the first thing we're going to talk about. So there are big risks that are almost always realized when we don't have SharePoint governance, right? Especially effective SharePoint governance. The first and most obvious one is sprawl issues. It could be security sprawl, it could be site sprawl, it could be document or content sprawl, it could be a lot of different types of sprawl. So let's give an analogy or a story to help communicate that. This is a story about the world's largest house, and basically this wooden house that was built was only meant to be a two-story house. He just wanted to make it a little bit bigger than his neighbors. And this gentleman, when he was building it, actually added 3 floors at first because he was like, why not, when I have the wood and I have basically the time and energy to build this, make it even more grandiose. And as he did that, he realized that it actually looked kind of weird and odd. And so he started to add more layers, and he started to add more levels to the house, and he had it, both wide and tall. And eventually he even got to the point where he was building rooms for the contractors, for the people who were, the construction leads and foremans that were actually working on the house at all times. They actually had rooms within this wooden house. That's how crazy this was. And so this became this crazy house that was meant very, very simple, meant for very simple things, quickly came, very grew out of scope, grew out of proportion, and now parts of it are dilapidated and falling apart even as they try and repair it. It's just this never-ending battle that is clearly something that's going to end in a bit of tragedy. So what's important here is that, from a SharePoint perspective, we're not really talking about wooden houses, but we are talking about something similar in that scope does increase, the amount of content we have increases, the number of sites and unique uses of SharePoint is going to increase over time. And so it's really important for us to manage that. It's really important for us to review content, review accuracy and relevance of content, and not only for content but also for security, right? We could say the exact same thing around security or sites, or in some cases, if you'd like to get into it, keyword management or anything within SharePoint. Really, there's the chance of sprawl, and the way we mitigate that is through review and management. And then there's this quality deterioration challenge. So a lot of organizations have this fear, right? They don't want to deteriorate their quality of the content within, say, your portal on the homepage, or maybe within a specific subset, maybe a document library somewhere has really key content. And so this is a really, really true risk that's associated with governance not being enacted appropriately. If we don't have the right policies in place, we could lose quality, or we could deteriorate in quality because things aren't going through approval processes. People could lose confidence. There's all sorts of reasons that this is a real risk without governance. Then there's this frustration failure. So, users go to use SharePoint, and because the user experience is so convoluted, complex, because you have poor processes in place and you're inefficient from an IT perspective, let's say, and not able to respond to user requests from a lot of different avenues, from branding. You go to one site and the navigation is this, and then the next site the navigation is completely different. The images and links on the pages are very, very different. The structure of the pages are very different, and it leads to this dissatisfaction from a user experience and frustration level. So we want to really mitigate a lot of that, and that's part of what governance is going to help with. Addition to that, one of the biggest ones is that we get this priority paralysis. We get all of these priorities, number one, highest priority initiatives that come in for SharePoint, and we get into them, we start to deal with them, and we realize that they're not all priority ones. There are things that really are more important, and it's really important to have that communication channel go across. So again, one of the big risks of governance, or not having governance, is that we don't have that clear decision-making authority, and we also don't have escalation, so that when there are issues, where there are deviations, etc., we can deal with them in a timely manner. And then lastly, we have this ineffective use of time and resources, probably my favorite one to talk about, and that's basically that you're spending all your time on things that really aren't delivering the business value that you really wanted the portal and the SharePoint investment to deliver. So again, coming and bringing it back, that's the idea, that governance that I really like, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So just remember, it's not about ensuring against or mitigating these risks. I've outlined a few. There's more risks than this. We could talk about compliance. We could talk about all sorts of other risks. There are very real risks that governance is meant to help mitigate. The reality is it's not just about mitigating those risks, though. Without effective governance, organization performance and capability are significantly reduced. Well, what does that mean, right? Well, what that really means is without governance, it's kind of like a football team without clear teams, right? Without clear roles and responsibilities within those teams. It's like one day the quarterback being the kicker, and the next day the quarterback being the linebacker, right? It doesn't make sense. And in the same way, we know that it doesn't make sense for a developer, as an example, to take on a whole lot of roles that maybe that developer isn't used to, or not as effective at. And so it's really important that we define roles and responsibilities, and we define teams within SharePoint to train in, that we can build talent and skills. And just like a football team needs plays and other things and coordination and coaching, we also need to make sure as an organization we have the business strategy in place. We have the clear plans and priorities and other things like that, and that everyone knows what everyone else is doing. The two quickest ways to find out an organization doesn't have good governance is to basically ask them, why are you using SharePoint? If everyone can't answer that question, then you have a problem. And another big one is when you ask people, well, can I get a new site provisioned? And it's not a clear, easy process to do something like that, or any other SharePoint process that's fairly common and frequently asked for. So again, governance, very important, and it's really about making us more effective. It's really about capitalizing on that SharePoint investment. It's really about playing better. You've spent all this investment in time and energy on your SharePoint talent, and trust me, in today's marketplace, you want to retain that talent. You want to grow that talent, because at the end of the day, it's a very competitive marketplace, and other people are going to snap up your best talent from you if you're not able to really give them that environment in which they can excel in. And again, with governance, it's sort of like having that football team or that coordinated team effort, and that's what I'll kind of come back to. So hopefully at this point, from a very high level, you've got a depiction of how you might be able to communicate why governance is important and why it's really required, right? And this is a very important stress point. It's not just insurance. It's not mitigating risks. You're actually making your investment more successful by implementing governance and by investing in governance. So let's talk about building the governance teams. So like our football example, we need to have different teams, right? We need to have different roles and responsibilities. So let's talk about that. The best way that I've seen this work over time is that typically it involves 5 teams. And while you may be a small organization and you may see 5 teams and go, whoa, that's a lot of teams, that's a lot of coordination, that's a lot of responsibilities to break down. The reality is, even if you have one person, they're wearing these different hats, right? They're taking on the different roles of these teams throughout the process. So again, these teams are really important, and what they represent is more important even than their structure. However, at the end of the day, teams work. It really works. If I say the word committee, it has different connotations in different organizations. If I use the word, council, has different connotations. So it's really important for you to find the right verbiage. If team is a little bit too simple for your organization, you can always go with those other more advanced ones. Communities, for maybe development as an example. I'll get into some specific scenarios where that can happen. But again, team is what I found is typically agnostic. No one really gets bothered by using that definition, and from that point onward, it's really just a focus on what these teams represent than the actual structure of the teams. So there are two strategy teams. We're going to talk about them first. The first team in the strategy circle is basically the business strategy team. Now this team's purpose is actually pretty straightforward. The business strategy team is meant to provide strategic insight. What I mean by that is they're actually giving the objectives. They're saying these are the business objectives, these are the things we want to achieve over the next 2 years, 1 year, however much time. And all these business units, all these representative areas of the business are getting together and communicating that, and they're communicating it effectively. And it's really important that this team's membership isn't just IT, that it represents other areas of the business. Now, one of the things that I do want to caution against, I'm not saying involve everyone from the start, because that's never a good idea, and especially when you need to get progress, you need to move things along. However, it's really important that the clear stakeholders and those who've invested in it are involved. So if you want to start framing discussions, that's how I like to normally phrase it. If you're starting framing governance and things like that, you may only involve IT and HR and maybe another core business unit or two, and then over time kind of extend it. But the goal is eventually for this membership to extend across the organization. What's more, it can't just be centralized. If you're a geographically distributed environment, you have multiple offices, branch offices, and other things like that, it's really important that over time they have a voice as well into governance, right? They have a voice into, these are our objectives, and there may be objectives that they have that aren't the same as the business. Maybe they have needs that the core business may not see right away, and so it helps kind of bring those to the surface, and then of course you can prioritize them accordingly. So let's talk about all these objectives and how do we actually tackle this? How do we break objectives down? How do we prioritize them? And how do we actually use that information to move our projects forward? So to do this, I'm actually going to go to another application and show you through that. Now, those who have seen me present before all know that I love MindJet Mind Manager, which is a mind mapping program, and that's what we're going to use for our demonstration today. So this is what typically happens, right? When we have a SharePoint project or a SharePoint implementation, we come up, or the business comes up with these generic objectives. Now there's different terms for this. I really like Paul Cumsey's use of the word platitude, so I'm going to use that, where these are platitude-like objectives, right? They're basically these really nice things that everyone can agree with. We're going to centralize knowledge and resources. We're going to enhance collaboration. The issue with that is that it's very difficult to measure, right? I can't tell you when we've enhanced collaboration. I can't tell you when we have completed or achieved the goal we set out from enhancing collaboration. Instead, what we need to do is we need to break these objectives down. When we say words like we want to centralize knowledge and resources, we want to know what knowledge and resources. How do you want to do that? When I say I want to automate and improve business processes, we need to say, well, what business processes? So we break it down. We say, well, what business processes? You say, well, paper-based ones, legacy system ones, etc., etc. So if I wanted to dig that deeper, I would say, well, what paper-based processes? Oh, the HR ones. Okay, which HR paper-based processes? Those that relate to onboarding. Oh, okay, now we're a bit more particular. Now we can actually start to think of the SharePoint solutions that come to mind. We can start to think of how can we achieve this? How can we know when we've achieved this? And if we move our way back, if we look at this, we're saying we want to automate and improve paper-based processes that relate to HR that are specifically oriented around onboarding, and we can break that down further. But at this point, we're at a much greater level of granularity and at a higher level of success, because at this point we're able to say these are the ways that we can achieve this. These are the ways that we can determine whether or not this has been successful. You're going to break this down a little bit further and say, well, what we really want to do is reduce the amount of time it takes for onboarding. We want to do this, we want to do that. And so when you've broken down those objectives, now it becomes much easier to align SharePoint solutions and other things with those objectives. It's really important that the business is doing this. Now, most businesses are doing this. They're just doing it in different ways. All I'm saying is this is the fundamental aspect or tenet of what this team is meant to be doing. They're meant to be going through, breaking down objectives, communicating those to the rest of the business, and prioritizing those objectives. So here I have a very simple prioritization schema where I've said, well, in this case, the paper-based processes are the first ones we want to deal with, then we want to deal with legacy ones, and so on and so forth. The reality is that prioritization is a bit of a challenge. So when you are tackling prioritization, just use the different methods that work in the industry. There's lots of them, and what you'll do is you'll find that over time you can actually prioritize all of these business objectives pretty cleanly, even if there's different business units that are guiding them. And of course, each business unit can always fund the business objectives they want to achieve as well, which deals with some of the cost of ownership issues that you'll experience. So again, if I break down centralizing knowledge and resources, we can go further on each of these. What's really important here with these objectives is not my sample objectives, which are completely samples. It's that the point that we're breaking down our objectives to the point where we can actually say, this is how we're going to achieve it, right? We already are coming up with solutions. We're already thinking of how we're going to achieve it, and what it means, why the only way we can come up with solutions for objectives like that is by breaking them down to that level where we can really understand it and where there's not a lot of miscommunication or a lot of misinterpretation of what that objective really is and how we want to achieve it. So with that, let's jump back to the presentation. Now at this point, we've actually determined what our business objectives are. We've broken them down to a level that's understandable from the technology side. So if I'm a technology expert, I can take some of these objectives and I can already start to build solutions from them. And what we've also done is we've prioritized all these objectives. So we've clearly communicated the priority from the business side around which objectives should be met first, which ones are the most important, and maybe even given some timelines. I would hope that the next step for the business side would also be to set some expectations around when they'd like to achieve these. Now remember, this is only when they'd like to. The technical strategy team, which is the one we're going to talk about next, this team that we're dealing with is going to basically say, hey, this is when we can actually achieve it. So again, it's a mixed environment in terms of who actually manages expectations, the technical team managing the technical expectations, and the business team managing the business expectations around delivery timelines and goals and things of that nature. So let's dig deeper into this technical strategy team. Let's dig deeper into the team that says this is how we're going to achieve those specific business objectives. So the solution or technical strategy team is really oriented around one thing and one thing only. They're really saying, here is the technology that we're going to use for these instances, and this is how we're going to achieve those business objectives. Now this is a high level. It doesn't necessarily mean tactically exactly how everything's going to be executed. It's really just saying, in a general sense, this is the type of project or this is the type of solution on SharePoint, let's say, that we're going to implement that's going to help achieve objectives X, Y, and Z. So what that means is this team has to have interests represented from different areas, specifically the technical areas of our environment, right? So you have to have enterprise architecture, you have to have infrastructure, application development, because SharePoint is an enterprise technology platform. It's not just a application that sits on the shelf and sits with everything else. It's part of this overall enterprise technology plan, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I also have an example of people development and training and communications on here, because at the end of the day, sometimes you may deal with new technologies and you may need to involve other people from those technologies. So if I have a lead for maybe my ERP systems or other things like that, I may bring them in and have them as part of this team as we integrate with those systems. But also from a system-wide perspective, if we're implementing a solution, often that's going to involve training, that's going to involve communication, that's going to involve different aspects. And so we want to make sure that from, again, a technical perspective, those subject matter experts are included in this team. And this team is going to be one of the most complex in that it grows and changes as the business needs grow and change. So how does this really work, from a visual perspective? On the left-hand side here, I have sample solutions. So these are just very generic solutions that you might build in SharePoint. And on the top, I have samples, again, platitude-like statements of objectives, right? So if I wanted to enhance collaboration and I looked at this, at a glance, I would be able to determine that, of these solutions that I'm proposing, only 3 of them really have a direct impact on achieving or enhancing collaboration, right? And so these are the ones that I would maybe want to do first if this is the most important from a priority perspective business objective. Now, of course, we would be using more specific business objectives than these, but from a sample perspective, what I'm really saying here is you need to show visually, written, communicatively, it doesn't matter how you do it, but however you do it, you need to make sure it's clear, how do my solutions, these things that we're going to build in SharePoint or that we're going to leverage SharePoint for, how do they map to those business objectives we've identified earlier? Right? That's really important, because when you map them, you'll actually find that a better way to prioritize often is to actually use the business objectives and their priority to actually prioritize your solutions. What that means is, if I know onboarding in our previous example is the most important thing to HR, and HR says, hey, you know what, we want to make sure that's done first, and let's say this was onboarding, we would know which solutions we should be doing first versus other ones. Again, helps with prioritization, and it helps with also coming back and pushing back to the business, saying as a technical strategy team, we can only execute so much work. Our capacity bandwidth isn't there. We are missing resources. We don't have enough staff, whatever it happens to be. And in fact, we have enough staff for X, Y, and maybe all these other solutions, but we don't have enough staff for Z. And if you really want Z because it's going to impact these objectives, remember that the business understands these objectives, then they'll say, well, we'll fund that additional resource because it's that important to us. And voila, now a lot of your capacity issues and other challenges you have around SharePoint start to go away. So again, really important throughout this cycle, lots of communication, use different methods, but it's really important for this team to come up with those objectives and then to prioritize those objectives, and this is one way of doing that. It's also really important for this team to say, what will SharePoint be used for and what won't it be used for? Right? In every organization, SharePoint is going to be used for different things. In some organizations, they may already have another document management system in place that they use for whatever reason, compliance or other reasons that they've already invested in, where it's going to be the primary document management platform. And maybe it's for controlled documents, and then SharePoint is for uncontrolled or the more in-progress documents or work-in-progress type documents rather than finalized or whatever it happens to be. But you have to determine that as an organization. Where is the boundary line between SharePoint and other applications? Should I put contacts in SharePoint or should I put them in CRM? Is it that simple? Do we need to break it down more? So these are some quick examples. There's lots and lots of scenarios where you have to communicate this, but over time this may change. We still have to define it, right? That technical strategy team has to say, this is what we're using SharePoint for, and for these other systems we're going to do these types of business solutions. Again, just helps when we determine some of these business solutions that we saw earlier. Some of them may not be in SharePoint, and that's fine. If we know that they're not in SharePoint, we can still have different leads on them and everything else, but really it's not going to fall under SharePoint governance anymore. It's going to be more of an IT-wide governance. So again, really important, define what it is you're going to be using SharePoint for. And then both teams, if we look at both of the teams, both the technical strategy team and the business strategy team, they're going to define their own objectives, right? They're going to define those priorities. We've gone through some samples of both of those. They're also going to define, the technical strategy team especially is going to define these solutions, and they're going to give ownership of these solutions to different people. And that's really important as well, because there has to always be a clear owner. And from a platform classification perspective, what we're really talking about there is, what is it that we'll use SharePoint for? What won't we? From a communication planning and management, if we used a lot of the methods that I mentioned earlier, it's going to be really easy to communicate what it is we're trying to do, what it is we're trying to achieve. And again, same thing around resource and capability, because at the end of the day, both teams can communicate to each other what their expectations are, and both teams have to work together, both IT in this example, because that's heavily the technical team, and then the business team. They have to work together to determine, how are we going to meet these objectives, what's reasonable, what's impractical, and so on and so forth. So really important. The strategy teams are probably the most important teams when it comes down to what's often missing from implementations. So spend some time, make sure these teams are in place. And again, if it seems like a lot, just take it by piecemeal. Figure out what can you do right now that makes it better than what you're doing today. So without further ado, let's jump into the tactical teams. So there are 3 tactical teams for SharePoint. There's the operations team, the development team, and the support team. We'll start with the operations team. So what does the operations team do? This is the team that's fighting those server fires. This is the team that's responsible for business continuity, performance, and availability, right? This is the team that's really broken down of domain administration, infrastructure, networking, servers and environments, quality assurance, security, databases. These are the guys that are basically keeping everything running from an operational perspective. They're the guys who are doing routine maintenance. They're doing those backups. They're doing analysis and monitoring and other things like that. They're making sure that security is being kept up to date, and patches and releases and upgrades. Again, this team is very important to SharePoint, and the reason we separate them as a team is because if they're able to work together and able to meet and orient themselves and create policies and procedures for themselves, they'll be able to do that much more rapidly than if we involve other people, or again, from a patterns and practice perspective, it allows them to work with each other and really build this domain of knowledge for SharePoint. Again, how does this break down from operations responsibilities? This is what people love, right, to spend their time and energy when we get into governance on. They love to say, well, what are the documents, right? What are the deliverables that these teams are responsible for? So here's a sampling of what the operations team might do. They might create a disaster recovery plan. I hope so. I hope you have a disaster recovery plan in SharePoint. I hope that you have storage and quota policies. It's really important. They might do maintenance plans, monitoring plans, service level agreements, deployment policies and schedules, and everything else. So again, this team is going to come up with a lot of different documents and deliverables and other things, but it's really important that they're just meeting on a regular basis and tackling these things. Remember, it's the same idea as that original example when we had the football teams. It's meeting together, it's coordinating, it's learning together, and that's what's going to make this team really stand out. And it's really important that you don't have a consultant or somebody else come in and just build these documents for you. You can get an advisor, you can get a consultant to come in and say, here's how you should build them, or here's what I would do in your case, etc., and that's fine. But you have to take ownership for these documents. It's the operations team responsibility to update these documents. They're always going to need to be updated. Every one of these documents on a regular basis is going to be updated as the organization matures, as its usage of SharePoint matures, and as the patches and other things and upgrades and other things, and even industry sources start to impact how you approach SharePoint implementations. Again, very important that the team takes ownership for all of this content. So that's the operations team. Let's talk about the development team, right? What does the development team do? Well, these guys are the ones that are actually using SharePoint to really build these business solutions, right? They're building technical solutions on SharePoint, or they're building business solutions on SharePoint. What do I mean by that? Well, business solutions are solutions that are built by business users or business owners or other people like that from the business side, and the technical ones are where we get like the Visual Studio type developers, or we get IT, etc., to build and structure these solutions. Again, there are two different types of solutions, and what this team is really doing is it's oriented around what are the patterns and practices for that, what are the standards we need to put in place, all those types of things. So again, the representative interests are not just Visual Studio, source control, and things like that, but there's also this sort of SharePoint Designer aspect to it. All those people that use SharePoint Designer. There's also people that just use templates. You create templates on a regular basis. That could be a orientation of or a classification or representative interest of people within the development team. And that's why this team specifically is one of the few that it's often quickly called a development community over time, just due to the nature of their interaction. So again, this team is very important, and it's often highly skilled programmers initially, but over time eventually involves technical savvy end users who do a lot of different work. So what does this team produce, right? What are the things that they're kind of responsible for? Well, branding, right? They're going to determine what are our styles and guides and things of that nature. They're going to determine how are we implementing workflow and how are we supporting it and things of that nature. They're going to come up with development standards, right? If I was to go to spstandards.com, you can see it down there. If I was to go to this website, that website's going to have a bunch of these standards as an example, and it's going to have some templates and other things. If I have time at the end, I'll show that. So it's really important for you to go to different resources and develop your own set of standards. Don't just lift what I have up on spstandards.com and say, oh, we've got our standards. Make sure that you're digesting it and making sure that it fits your business, right? So again, then this is interesting. On this one, both operations and development had deployment process, policies, and schedule. Remember, there are going to be things that aren't just one team's responsibility. So let's dig into that, right? A deployment process is going to involve multiple teams, right? In the developer's workstation, and maybe in the SIT environment or integrated testing environment, maybe even in the source control or source code environment, all those environments might be development's responsibility. So the development team dictates the policies for that. They develop how they want to do unit testing, how they want to do code review, all those types of things. But over time, it's perhaps the operations team that deals with it when it goes to the UAT environment or the user acceptance environment or the QA environment, if you want to phrase it that way, or whatever it happens to be, or production especially. So again, you may delineate certain aspects of this to different teams from a responsibility perspective, or you might have the teams just work together and there's no clear ownership like that, and that's fine too. But what's really important is that even though I'm creating these teams and you may see it as creating silos, what we're really trying to do is just optimize the processes around these teams, right? There are activities that development people are going to do on a regular basis where there's value in them meeting and discussing and sharing patterns and practices, concerns, issues, things like that may not necessarily apply in the majority of cases to operations staff. So again, that's why we've differentiated. And the last team that I'm going to give an example of here is the support team, right? The support team is probably one of the trickiest ones because they're the ones who are making the magic happen. Somehow they're making it so that the SharePoint platform and the applications on it and other things that we're building, that those all work in our organization and that people understand them and that people can use them. So they, the help desk, the service desk, it's the people development and training, it's the knowledge managers of the world, it's the people who are handling the metadata and other things like that, who are coaching users on a regular basis. And so, this is important. There's some framing work that needs to be done clearly by a strategic team on this level of training. How do we deal with question and issue escalation and resolution? How do we involve influential users and leaders, right? How do we involve those super users? How do we give them responsibilities, but more importantly, not just give them responsibilities, but give them benefits. So if you take on these additional stewardship roles and additional workloads, then in return you're going to get these perks like access to Productivity Hub or access to some other system, right? So it's really important. So again, what does this team really produce? Well, lots of things. They could produce, what types of sites we have. We have this type of site, we have that type of site, and these sites exist for different reasons. And to that discussion, they define how are we going to do site provisioning. What are the types of questions we need from other users before we can provision a site from them. How do we deal with user expectations, and how are we going to deal with communication, if there's outages and other things like that. And maybe this is again an outage scenario or breaking down SLAs and other things like that. That's not just going to be the support team, that's obviously going to include the operations team. If we're talking about customization, policies, and release cycles, that could involve the development team. So again, it's really important to understand that these teams often will work with each other as well. And so I can go on and on and on about the support responsibilities. We can dig into user lifecycle and all these other things. And again, you can see some of these examples at spstandards.com, but it's really important that you come up with the right responsibilities. And I will tell you, if you get these people just meeting on a regular basis, and their goal is to meet and talk about what can we do to make SharePoint more effective, what policies can we enact, what processes can we put in place, what guidance and nice things can we give people to try and help them, all those types of things. If they start to meet, they're going to come up with all the stuff that I've already mentioned, and probably more, right? So it's really important just to get those people meeting, to kick off this process of tackling support effectively. And of course, one of the things that they're going to come up with is that obviously SharePoint support's not very simple. It's not you can have one just help desk ticket layer and you deal with the issues there. It's going to have multiple layers. It's going to involve multiple groupings, including self-help resources and other things. It's going to have lots of escalation paths. So again, the support group is going to have to involve other people. They're going to have a voice into this group. They're going to have to verify whether things are working, and so on and so forth. It's also important, obviously, to measure support. So this team is going to use a lot of different measurements, just like the other teams are, to determine, what knobs to change. How should they, put pressure on this? Should they enact this new policy? Is this policy working? If a lot of incident reports are coming up saying something's wrong, then you might want to look at that and reevaluate. Maybe we should remove this policy because it's just slowing things down, right, before it can cause actual detrimental harm. A great example of that is when some organizations, because of site sprawl, they enact these very, very rigorous processes for site review, and site provisioning, and that actually causes the organization to slow down and grind to a halt when it comes to actually being able to execute the work that made SharePoint so successful. So again, you really have to find the proper middle ground for yourself and what's going to work for you. So I've mentioned all these governance teams. I just want to mention a couple quick little tips. One of them is that you make sure, if possible, to have one member in each of the teams, right, that's actually consistently in each of those teams, right? If I have one user or member who's in every one of the teams, then it makes it just easier to communicate across those teams. You know, in the development meeting, when they start talking about something, they might go, wait a second, we were just talking about that in the operations team. Why don't I bring that back to them, see what their thoughts on it, and bring it back to you, and so on and so forth. Or why don't we both get together and discuss, you know, our deployment policy, if that's the issue or whatever it happens to be. This is a great way for, at least initially, even if you're a large organization, for reducing the chances of that silo effect that we don't want to have. And then this is another governance tip that I found very effective recently, and that's creating this sort of container team, if you will, which is the business solution governance team, or whatever name you want to use it. And this team allows you to find the business users. So what you do is you say, business users, would you like to be a part of, you know, the strategy and the leading of SharePoint in our organization? You know, if you're an influential user, you're going to throw them in this group. If someone provisions a site and they say, I want to be the owner of this site, or they're the site requester, they might be added to this group automatically. And what this gives you is, this gives you as an organization an insight or a view of all of the people who are using SharePoint, championing SharePoint, or who could be influential users who might want to eventually be promoted to, again, be in the development the tactical development team, or in the support team, and so on and so forth, or even in the business strategy team, right? So it's really important to have this sort of layer, whether it's a team or other methods, that helps you identify those people. So one of the ways that we've seen recently in success is that people have created this sort of mock team and then add people to that. Alright, so let's review everything we've just covered. At this point, hopefully, if we create those teams, and those teams are meeting on a regular basis, and they're deploying and delivering and creating all of those great products that we saw in the responsibility section, you know, the disaster recovery plan, you know, the development standards, or the you know, the site provisioning process. If they're doing that, then what's happening is, over time, they're developing this shared understanding of all the SharePoint-related processes. Now, they're not developing an understanding of all technology-related processes. We don't want to boil an ocean. We're really focused on SharePoint here, but it's really important that you start to see this shared understanding. So when you ask that question, if we have all those teams in place and they're working, and you say, you know, what are we using SharePoint for? Because the business strategy team's been communicating, because the technical strategy team's been communicating, because the tactical teams are executing on that strategy, what they're able to do is every one of those people should be able to answer that question, right? And the same thing comes down to little specific tactical questions like, how do I provision a site, things of that nature. And now, this is a really important one. Don't just think it's those documents. Don't just look at those responsibility slides and say, okay, we're just going to do those things, right? It's that ongoing process. It's actively meeting. It's actively communicating with each other that's really going to cause people to take ownership for those documents. It's going to cause those things to evolve over time and really mature and really represent what the business is trying to do, which, remember, will really lead to a much better investment. We're going to get better return on our investment as a result. So the next thing I want to do is give some tactical advice around setting up what I call a SharePoint governance site. So what is a SharePoint governance site? And why do we need a SharePoint governance site? Well, a lot of people say a governance plan is really important. And a plan is really important, but a plan should never be considered just a document. That's a bad idea. Having a single governance document is just something that doesn't work. It's never worked in any of the implementations I've ever done with clients over time. It works great in the first little bit, but over time it starts to develop and grow and change, etc. And as the maturity and the processes and the usage of SharePoint matures or changes in the organization, so does the governance documentation. And so breaking up that documentation into separate documents, having different owners for those different documents, using the SharePoint features for that ongoing collaborative process of updating these documents, all of those things are great reasons why you should use a SharePoint site, right? If I know that the user expectation agreement policy has been updated and I've been alerted to that as a person in the support tactical support team, I'm able to determine whether or not I need to make additional changes to it, or whether I need to change the way I'm running my process or my procedure, etc. So it's really, really important when we have this sort of collaborative nature, which is really what governance is, right? It's a lot of people working together to steer something. Then it's really important to have a governance site, in my opinion. So what could be in a governance site? Well, you could have announcements, right? Hey, we've released some new documentation, released some new stuff, and that can go out to the rest of the organization. We might have our solutions, right? I mentioned all those solutions that you're coming up with. There's going to be a ton of stuff that you're doing with SharePoint. So let's make sure they're indicated, they're written down, who's the owner. If you want to, you can add start dates, end dates, and statuses. You can even use Gantt chart-like capabilities of SharePoint to visualize that. Now, if you don't want that, that's fine too. If you want to use a separate project management system, do that. But make sure that you at least have some sort of listing so anyone who's interested can know what all the SharePoint projects are, what are all the things that are in the pipeline that revolve around SharePoint. And that also helps certain people understand and get the right expectations that, oh, you know what, my things are being done, but these other things that are going to help me are also being done first. You have to have team rosters and definitions. I mentioned all those teams. Well, keep the rosters of who's on those teams. Really show people that they can become a part of it, and show that you're engaging the rest of the organization. It's not just IT, it's not just the business, it's this hybrid of everyone working together to really achieve something good. Having policy standards and guidelines is great, but let's make sure that we're using search, we're using metadata, we're using all those capabilities of SharePoint to make it easier to filter, to find, to review these policies and guidelines. Let's also make sure we have workflows, if necessary, to deal with approvals. Some people have even used, wiki-like formats. Again, I'm a little bit more adverse to that. When I suggest using wiki-like formats in SharePoint, it's more around using OneNote. So I might recommend using OneNote for patterns and practices, because multiple people can author it. When you add a picture to it, it automatically indexes it, and all sorts of other advantages. But whatever you end up doing, whatever format you end up using, SharePoint's going to help you do that, right? The out-of-the-box native capabilities come in really handy. You want to come up with frequently asked questions. You want to come up with those glossaries. Again, I have an example of a glossary online. You can feel free to download it afterwards. Again, if you go to my website, it's there. So it's really important to grab these terms, because it's new to a lot of people, and frequently asked questions can be a great time saver. You get a lot of requests, you can tell them, hey, by the way, if you ever run into this again, it's here, and so on and so forth. Patterns and practices. Like I said, I love OneNote over wikis. So when I have those groups meeting, when we're meeting as a development team, or we're meeting as the operations team, and we're starting to go over issues and other things like that, there's going to be a lot of things that we learn over time. The operations team's going to learn that, hey, you can't do this, this, and this. You have to do, C before you do A and B, and so on and so forth. And if we're the development team, we're going to determine, hey, there's, we realize that SharePoint Designer isn't so great for this, or maybe we shouldn't be supporting this. And so you can create that dialogue and track it in this type of format, whether it's wikis or whether it's OneNote or even just documents. And then over time, those can evolve into new policies, new procedures, or even just guidance for end users. And there's also team resources and minutes, right? These teams are meeting on a regular basis, so if there's people who aren't able to attend the meetings, there's value in having that. From a resources standpoint, one of the things that can happen there is you might have industry reports or other things you want to share across the team. So again, that can be valuable. There's some great reports around like intranets, the top intranets and things like that. So you might want to share that across your teams, or other things. Maybe Microsoft resources on something, etc. Feedback and surveys, right? We want to be able to encourage feedback. We want to figure out ways of getting feedback from users. And so again, we can use surveys and built-in SharePoint functionality to really engage. Is governance working? Is the site provisioning process working? What are you using SharePoint for? What do you think it sucks about our SharePoint implementation? And so on and so forth. Self-help and support. I love Productivity Hub. I think it's great. So you could try that out if that's not something you really want to use. This is a free solution from Microsoft, which allows you to install as a separate site collection, so on and so forth. So you can go look at it. It's great. It's a great collection of resources that Microsoft updates quarterly. If you want to create your own, you can add to this. You can use this as your starting point and build from it, or you could create a completely separate way of doing, sort of learning management. Remember, this is not like a true LMS. This is just more of a series of self-help resources. but it's a way of at least giving people access to those things. So again, your governance site can contain a lot of these support resources, or at least a link to things like Productivity Hub. And maybe you even give only certain people access to Productivity Hub, like those that are on the teams, right? Again, you can figure out how you want to roll this out, what stages you want to roll it out, and so on and so forth. Again, there's this I use SharePoint. If you go to iusesharepoint.com, it's a great little collection of resources and reference guides and things like that you can use that can help users understand what is SharePoint, like what should I use it for, etc. A site listing is super important, right? We create all of these different sites. I talked about at the very beginning the site sprawl issue. Well, how do we deal with that? One of the ways is we manage them. We create a listing of all the sites. We say who's the owner, who's the backup or the secondary owner of the site, what's the purpose of the site, where is it located, how often is it being used, and maybe last time we engaged and looked at that site, reviewed it, etc., sorry. And so we can use this and define how are we going to tackle managing and processing sites. And this listing we want to share with the rest of the organization so that when a person asks a question like who does own the site, they can go find out, right? So again, there's really no reason not to share this. And even as an organization, I can actually see which sites I'm an owner for and realize, oh wait a second, maybe I shouldn't be an owner for some of these sites, or maybe someone else should be. So there's a lot of reasons that this adds value by having a complete site listing. So the outcome here is that by using the SharePoint platform, we're actually effectively managing SharePoint. We're using SharePoint's native capabilities rather than a single document or something that's really unsustainable, and we're using metadata like assigning owners or assigning alerts and using version history and other things like that to really get the benefit of collaboratively working on all this governance documentation. So it's really important. Use SharePoint. It works great. Additionally, just having the governance site isn't enough. Remember that content has to remain fresh. So creating the site, throwing a bunch of content in it, and then leaving it, if you don't have those teams, if they're not meeting, if there's not that orientation around that and this encouragement and investment from the organization to support that, what's going to happen is that content's going to become stale, it's going to become irrelevant, and you actually have an issue of confidence loss over time for all the reasons we mentioned earlier. So we are running out of time. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to cover a couple examples of governance resources. If you want to hear more about this or you want to get more governance resources, feel free to email me or message me or let me know, and I can send you a greater summary. But the reality is, here's a couple key ones. Governance, or Microsoft is great. They really are. They've done a great job of giving technical guidance, right? At the end of the day, they'll tell you, there's white papers that outline, what are the out-of-the-box controls that I can enact that help with governance. They'll tell you, this is what we would do if we were implementing governance. In fact, they've even released sort of their approach from a Microsoft standpoint on governance. So it's really important to look over that information. Again, it's not necessarily all going to directly apply to you, but at least it gives you some ideas. One of the things they did back in the day was they had this checklist. The checklist was great not for actually going through and checking things off, but for introducing things to you in terms of thoughts and ideas that you might not have encountered in your normal work. Like, hey, should we create a sitemap for our overall site structure? Hopefully you do, and there's lots of ways to do that. Should we hire an information architecture professional? Hopefully you do, and there's lots of ways to do that. So again, just lots of ideas in these checklists that are worthwhile. Obviously there's a ton of material out there from the community as well. There's frameworks that exist too. Many organizations right now have this idea that we have to use this draconian control, or we have to use this sort of let everyone go Wild West, right, perspective, and that's not true. There's not necessarily just happy middle ground. It's that sometimes we use imposed governance models, sometimes we use empowered models, and what I mean by that is sometimes we use policies, if you will, and sometimes we use guidelines. So if a project exists, then that's probably something we're going to impose governance on. For projects and project sites and other things like that, we're going to say these are the policies, this is how you must create them, this is how you work with them, this is how they're managed. But for things like communities, we might say, well, here's the guidelines. Please don't go outside these guidelines, or you'll be punished, or there'll be some sort of incident management. So again, we empower these rather than necessarily control them directly. And again, from a user perspective, we might give people, here's some best practices, here's some guidance, here's the things that we found work well, but it's up to them to determine when to use those practices, right? You can't just say these are the best practices, you will always abide by these, because there are times when those best practices won't always apply. There are always exceptions. So that self-determination can be really important. So you're empowering those people. Then there are times when we have tasks. You must do this, then you must do that, and so we can create these sort of compliance scenarios. Of course, we can also talk about governance control levels. We could say at the higher levels, when we talk about homepage, functional areas, department sites, these are public, they're open, they're tightly controlled, there's formal governance. If we go below that line, you can have sort of the opposite. So if you have these public-facing department sites, we also have these private department sites that often exist. Again, they're open to the business group, specifically the department, but not necessarily open to the rest of the organization. They have some control, some governance, but not as much as maybe the above the line perspective. And then we even have below that another subset of project and initiative team sites or other types of team sites. And so these team sites, may be open to team members, but again, have less control and so on and so forth as we go down the levels. And now, of course, I'm using this model. There's lots of other people who talk about this, Susan Hanley and Scott Jameson and other people. So this is not new. I'm just saying that this is a really important to understand the differences between above line and the below the line, and to really understand that you can't control everything, and you don't want to control everything. There's times, like I said, when imposing governance makes sense, and when empowering governance makes sense. You could have an ITIL framework in your organization, and maybe you want to just tie SharePoint to that. Maybe that's how you enact a lot of your governance rules and regulations and processes. You might have COVID if you don't have ITIL. You might find this book valuable, by the way, if you're dealing with COVID. You might also be dealing with MOF and say, we're going to use the MOF framework, the Microsoft Operations Framework. Whatever method you use, whether it's ITIL, COVID, or MOF, what's important is each one of these treats SharePoint as a service. And as a result, they have different rules and policies and processes and procedures that are in place. It's the same stuff I've already talked about in all those other areas. It's just, again, using a framework that's external and using that to kind of coach or orient a lot of your governance. That doesn't change the importance of the teams. It doesn't change the importance of having a governance site. It doesn't change the importance of anything that I've mentioned so far. All it's doing is it's saying there can be additional framework layers on top of this that can add a lot of value. So one of the things that's out in the community is this maturity model. It's great. It's a great way of kind of outlining here's where I am in terms of maturity. So please feel free to take a look at it. And then, of course, this is going to impact your governance planning because there's going to be different things that you might want to coordinate around. So again, it's worthwhile taking a look at other models that exist out there. There's more than just the SharePoint maturity model. There's ECM maturity models and document management maturity models and other things out there. Again, feel free to message me if you're interested in those. So there's a ton of material out there to support you. That's what's really important here. Not just what I'm saying, there's lots of other stuff out there. And there's lots of contrarian opinions to what I might have even said today. So please make sure you look out there. Don't just use one source. And remember that any of this stuff, including everything that I've said to you today, may not always apply, right? You got to determine yourself, be that self-deterministic perspective of this works for me, this may work for me, I really like this idea, but I'm not sure about this one, and determine what order you want to implement these things in and how you want to implement them. Or, go to an advisor that you can trust and say, how would you implement this? Or, what did you do as an organization when you implemented this? And so, with all of that, let's do a quick summary. What are the steps to effective governance? Well, number one, we have to understand the need for governance, right? Then we have to build our governance teams. We need to actually have those structures in place. And then from there, we want to understand how SharePoint is and should be used. From that, we want to say, well, at this point, now that we know what SharePoint is and should be used for, we want to develop those practice guidance policies, things like that, right? We want to say, in some cases, we're enacting policy, sometimes we're giving guidance. And then here's the secret. We actually go back and we rebuild our governance teams. We add members, we change members. And then we go back through understanding what SharePoint is being used for and what it should be used for, because it's changing, right? What we're currently using it for is going to be different in the next couple of months. And of course, the guidance and the policies are going to change as a result of both of those things. And so finally, the goal is to have perfect governance, but as most of you have already realized, this is an infinite loop. We can never get past 5, so we can never have perfect governance. But if you're walking through these steps and you're going through 2 and 5, you're actually achieving effective governance. And with that, thank you everyone, and we'll take questions at this point in time.